This is House Planning Help episode 28. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're wanting to self-build or renovate. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century with my own personal goal of creating an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. So in this session, we're looking at cohousing, and my guest is Mark Westcombe, one of the founders of Lancaster Cohousing. So I hope you're well. It's great to be doing another podcast, but it's not just any old podcast for me today. This marks 1 year of research that I've been doing. I've been doing this podcast for a whole year. And that's quite exciting. It's a little bit scary too, to think that I've allotted myself 4 years to be inside this more sustainable, energy efficient home. And one of those years has gone. I am going down I'm not sure whose route this was. It could even be Kevin MacLeod from Grand Designs, the idea of doing 3 years of research and planning of what's going to go on in the build, and then 1 year of the actual build, rather than the other way around of 1 year of planning, let's go for it, let's build the thing, and then running into all sorts of difficulties and it costing 3 times as much. So that is the plan. We're going to continue on the research for another year, and then hopefully I will be digging into more detail of exactly what I'm going to be doing in my build. But that said, to continue this podcast, we will keep on interviewing people, so nothing's going to change there. I might alter the emphasis a little bit towards retrofit, because I have a feeling that that's the way that I am more likely to go. My wife has always had a passion for the older buildings, but it does unsettle me a little bit, because as I've discovered more about modern design, and also that new build is slightly simpler, when it comes to retrofitting, I still haven't made up my mind what would be the right way to go. Yeah, I like the conservation route, but I also think energy efficiency is important. So still so much to discover. But I hope you're enjoying these podcasts, and we do love all of the questions that we've received. If I haven't answered your question, don't worry, it has gone into the system here, and it's a little bit slow, but I will get to it at the moment. I love having all of these different ideas of topics and areas to explore. So let's get into the main content for this session. And you might remember when I was at EcoBuild, if you heard episode 18, I spoke to Joe Gooding from the UK Cohousing Network. And we just got an overview of cohousing. I thought this is really interesting, something that I must explore at a later date. Then I got the opportunity to go to Lancaster Cohousing, and when I was there, I was very, very impressed. Not only is it cohousing, but it's passive house, and the two together I just think are groundbreaking, so I can see why it did end up being the award winner at the UK Passive House Awards. We'll talk more on that later, and I can point you off towards the video that we made of Lancaster Cohousing so you can get a visual of it as well. But my guest today is Mark Westcombe, and he's one of the founding members, and I started by asking Mark to explain what cohousing is.
Cohousing's a form of communal living. It's different to communes in that everybody's got their own home, which has got their own bathroom, kitchen, living room, bedroom. But then there's shared facilities on top of that. So the way I explain it to my mother's friends, it's a bit like a cul-de-sac. At the top of the cul-de-sac, you've got a small village hall. That's got a laundry facility, a children's room. It's got some spare bedrooms, so you don't have to have your spare bedroom at home. You can have a smaller house, a smaller mortgage. And then when people come to stay, they'll stay in our guest room, pay £7.50 for a room. Then we've got shared food stores, got shared outdoor space. So we've got very small private gardens, in my case a deck. And then we've got a couple of acres of land given the site that we purchased. And it's based on a Danish concept that originated in the 60s. And I think the key is that it's trying to facilitate spontaneous interaction between the residents or the neighbours. So our kitchens give onto the street. So our front door is next to our kitchens. So when people are walking up and down the street, they see you in the kitchen. And when you're in the kitchen, the Danes understood that you're more likely to be willing to interact with people than when you're sitting in the sitting room. So our sitting rooms are at the back of the house, and then that gives you your private space. Then in the cul-de-sac, we've got grassed areas, so we haven't got the cars coming down to the cul-de-sac. They park before you get to the village hall. So the kids are out playing. It's safe. You don't need a parent per kid. There's normally like 2 or 3 adults. There might be parents, might not be parents, and the kids are running around on their bikes and playing, and the adults start chatting and they see people coming home from work and they might stop and chat, and then somebody will be coming out to get their laundry and they might chat, and somebody else will be maybe going down to our shop or store. So there's all this interaction that's happening, and you might have a 5-second nod of the head, a 90-second chat, borrow something, ask for something, or you might end up spending the whole evening with somebody or a group of people. So that's the sort of spontaneous interaction, and that means you get to know your neighbours really well, and then that gives way more to coordinating things with your neighbours. So in our village hall we have at the moment 4 meals a week together, so I cook once a month, and that means I get 16 meals back in return. And the meals, they're available from 6:15 to 7:15, so an hour and a half. Kids are in there in the early bit, adults are in there in the last bit. Some people go every time there's a meal on, and some people just go maybe once a month or something. So I think that's the nub of co-housing.
How did you start Lancaster co-housing? Because I'm aware this is not an overnight process, really, is it?
No, so we didn't know what we were getting into. One of us saw a primary school for sale, and he, with a couple of mates, had done a green eco-renovation on a house that they bought cheap and then sold on, renovated in their spare time, made a tiny bit of cash maybe, and he was interested in doing something bigger scale. So he saw it, sent an email around, said, anyone want to do this with me? I didn't want to get left out, so I said yes, and there were 2 other people who said yes, and so we put in a bid for the school. In that process, we got somebody else to come around to have a look at it, and I suppose as we've been looking at how can we subdivide this building up into 14 apartments, we started thinking, hey, why don't we, it's not a lot of land, why don't we turn the schoolyard into a communal garden? And then we've all got a big garden rather than 14 titchy gardens. And then how shall we get people into that garden? So rather than us having front doors, let's push people through the building into that back garden and make the main doors or the front doors off the garden, so people are seeing each other when they come home from work. And then we've got this corridor going through the school, so why don't we put the post there, and then people will pick their post up from the same place? And why don't we put a sofa there, and why don't we put the newspapers there, and then a kettle, and what about another sofa, and what about a photocopy and a printer? So kind of this corridor grew into a living room with a kitchenette. And then when Chris came round, who got round because he was a builder, to look at the roof and say how much renovation work we'd have to do so we could inform how much we were willing to bid for it, he said, I know what you're doing. You're doing co-housing, and I've got a book on it at home. And so I borrowed the book, and I was just like, oh my God, this is all I've wanted to do all my life. This is everything that's wrong with society. It's fractured. I've moved away from my parents. I haven't got a support network. I'm single, so I don't have interaction with kids. I'm from a certain generation, so I don't have interaction with people who are older than me, so I don't learn from them. So whereas my siblings live close to my parents, so my parents visit, and my dad helps to put rails up so my siblings get to see how you do that, and I don't get to see how to do that, so I have to buy people in to do it for me. And I was just like, yeah, wow. And I guess we didn't manage to buy the school, and I guess that idea fermented in the heads of 4 of us for about a year and a half. And then, short story is, we kind of committed to doing it. And then, maybe 4 years later, we finally managed to buy a piece of land that was the right size, the right price. And so the whole journey took us 7 years from sort of committing to doing it to moving in.
Is this privately funded? Is that what it adds up to in the end?
Our development is privately funded. So I put in my life savings minus £1,000, and like many of us, and we took the risk. Other communities in the UK are not necessarily privately funded, and there are quite a few different models available. So the Threshold Centre, which is in Gillingham, Dorset, they have some privately funded homes, and then they have a housing association that has got some shared ownership, and some fully rented accommodation. So they've got quite a good range of mixed tenure. Lilac in Leeds, which again has only recently opened in 2013. They've got, I think it's called mutual home ownership. So it's sort of a scheme where the community owns all the property and you buy into the company that owns the property. So some people might own the equivalent of 80% of their home, and some people might own the equivalent of 120% of their home. And they've had funding from the government to do that in the same way that some social housing gets funded. And at the moment, we've got some exciting developments that quite a few housing associations are interested in co-housing. So we've got Hanover Housing Association that's exploring about 3 projects that will be mixed tenure. And the really interested news in, was it early May 2013, the Housing Minister, Mark Prisk, has announced that some of the funding that's available for Community Right to Build will become available to co-housing projects. So that's about £35,000 per community in supporting, putting together a business plan, doing some initial site design, and getting to a point where a group could option a piece of land.
Let me see if I understand this correctly. So the 4 of you, does that mean that you had to put up the money for the whole thing, or you had to find the people that were going to live with you so that they could invest the money? How did you get to the stage where we are now, that we're virtually complete? You're on that final phase at the moment.
Yeah, so there were eventually 5 of us who committed and worked solidly for 6 months as a project team to put together a business plan and proposal. And we didn't have enough money between ourselves. Just buying the land was 600,000 plus stamp duty plus all the solicitors' fees. So when we bought the land, we'd sold, if you like, we got other people to join us, the concept to, I think we were 13 households. So probably putting in an average of maybe £45,000 each per household. Then in order to pay for lawyers, accountants, architects, I think we had to sell, and planning permission fees, another 5 houses, or the concept. And then to get us going, we had to sell another 6 houses, I think. And then that got us to the point where a bank was willing to lend us about £3 million. And then we sort of cash flowed it in a way that we finished some houses, sold those, got the money for those houses, and then used that money then to build or pay the builders to build the later phases. So we built 41 units in total, 35 houses, 6 flats. And I guess we've been finishing off on average about 6, 8 houses. And that will be funding then, not the next batch, but the batch after that.
Did you know how this was going to work? It seems to me that it's quite a big risk if you're not sure of this process of rolling, setting one thing up and then moving on to the other, and then suddenly you're talking about a big amount of money.
Yeah, you have to be not risk adverse, I think. A bit of entrepreneurship comes in really useful. So that's quite well understood in Denmark and the United States, where there's lots of communities that the early joiners are entrepreneurial and risk takers, maybe early adopters in it. And then people who've joined later in the project when things are more settled down and concrete and there's bricks and mortar going on, then that's an easier proposition to join at that point. But yeah, I had everything I owned was invested in this company, and it could have gone belly up. We were close to closing a £1 million land deal when the world, economy collapsed, and so we pulled back from that with about 2 weeks to go. That project wouldn't have been financially viable, I don't think, because we were in a rising housing market that suddenly lost in Lancaster about 18% of housing value. So it is risky. I don't know of any project that has gone belly up, and there's about 120 private developments in the US, and it's about 15 in the UK. I imagine I would probably have heard of one. But yeah, it's a big project.
Tell us a little bit about the location, because it is very special, and then how you spoke with the architects and came up with the design that we have now.
So the site that we bought just at the start of the housing crash was up for redevelopment for, I think, 60 houses and a multi-storey car park. The company went bankrupt and we bought it. Well, we made an offer within a few days, I think, of them going bankrupt, or at least being in receivership. The site is, I think it's about 5 or 5.5 acres. It's a pencil-thin site, probably close to about 3/4 of a kilometre, I guess, in length, along the River Lune. It's south-facing, which is ideal for passive solar gain. And a good 50% of us have got a pretty fantastic view of the river. And we've got a common house, so the village hall, in the middle of us. So most houses can see it. And certainly most people, when they're coming home from work, will walk past it. So we found the site. We'd already tendered for an architectural practice. So we'd gone through a fairly rigorous process of exploring all the architectural practices that we either doing something eco or something social. Invited about 12 practices to tender. I think about 10 did, or at least went through our first stage. And I think then we invited 4 of those onto our shortlist and interviewed all of those for half a day each. And we contracted EcoArc, which were just clear way and beyond anybody else that they brought both skills. They, had won award after award for first off-the-grid house, first passive house, first everything this. But also they were very, very interested in co-housing. They'd both lived at Findhorn Eco Village. They'd visited lots of co-housing projects in Denmark, and they had done some site layout for another client on co-housing, so they really understood the concept that we're doing. So it was a match made in heaven, really. Then they worked with us, which I'm sure must have been hard work for them at times. So they ran workshops with us, 40 adults in a room with the architects, and they'd be making suggestions. We'd be giving feedback to them. They'd go away. 2 weeks later, they'd come back with a whole pile of new designs, and then we'd have to spend a day as a group of 40 come into a consensus about what our houses were going to look like. Because although we've built 41 houses, we've essentially got 4 designs. All the 2-bedroom houses are identical, and there's no individualization whatsoever. I think only whether you got a balcony or didn't get balcony is the only difference any house has got, really. So that's unusual, I guess, in the self-build world, that we were co-commissioning, I guess, custom build, but that was more similar to what a traditional developer, I guess.
It's quite interesting, these spaces, because of the co-housing concept. You've mentioned your village hall where everyone can go and interact, but the use of space, I'm intrigued. It's the living space. It's very modest.
Well, one of the best things you can do environmentally, house building, is to build a small house, not to build a massive passive house code 6 with only 2 people living in it, like we see on Grand Designs. I mean, I've probably seen 1 eco house on Grand Designs, even though they're all eco in inverted commas. So I'm in a 3-bedroom house and I live in here on my own, and that's considered an exaggeration by most of my neighbours. But on the other hand, it's only 78 metres squared. So it's open plan downstairs. It's really well designed. I mean, it absolutely maximises on the space, both how the staircase works, but also that there's very limited sort of wasted corridor space. And that's even more so, I think, for upstairs.
You do really notice that, don't you? That there is no wasted corridor space. It's only now that I'm sitting in here that I think, God, that's crazy. Whenever we have a corridor that goes somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't part of the tender when we were looking for sort of Lucy and Andrew to do the design, but it is one of the things that impressed me, that we weren't looking for that, but they've done a very good job, I think, of making best use of very small spaces, and that must have been a really hard part of the brief for them, I think. Of course, one of the great things about Passive House is there's only one radiator. So that means rooms are much more flexible. You know, I've got no radiator upstairs at all, so you can put your bed against any wall. There's only one it's a small radiator downstairs.
Have you used it?
Yeah, I have had it on. Because I'm a single person in a 3-bedroom house, then I can't generate quite enough heat for this space. I'm also out at work a lot, and I travel for work a lot, and we've had a fairly cold winter. I'm hoping next year, because I've got to know how to live differently in a passive house, and it'll be the second winter, so the house will have warmed up. Because I moved in autumn, so the house was cold, it was drying out. So I'm hoping that next year I might not use the heating.
So what have you learnt about living this way? Was it just a clean switch over, or are there some elements of the passive house standard that have surprised you or that you've had to learn about? Or
I've certainly done some learning. I might have to think what that's been, but I have changed habits a bit. The surprise is, it's just a delight to get up in the middle of the night, go to the bathroom when it's warm. I slept all through the winter with my summer duvet. I did have to learn how to keep the upstairs cool enough for me to sleep. So I've learned by closing all the bedroom doors, it doesn't get as warm as the downstairs does. So I've learned to differentiate the upstairs heat from the downstairs heat. When you do your washing, your laundry dries in, 4 hours or something. And that's it's just incredible. You know, I live in the northwest of England. It's damp. Every house around you is damp. And your house is your laundry normally sort of got this musty smell on it by the time it's dried. And, I just haven't had that at all. When I cook, I don't get any condensation on the windows. In fact, I've never had any condensation on the windows at all. The sort of steam just seems to evaporate. And the filter, so we've got this, I can never remember, mechanical heat ventilation recovery system or something like that.
Mechanical ventilation with heat recovery.
Yeah.
Almost there.
So that's got filters on it, so that's not bringing in dust and it's not bringing in pollen. So my sinuses have opened. My breathing is better. I'm much more sensitive to the smell of wine and food, and also to the smells in the house as well. And the house doesn't smell because all the air's being circulated once an hour, so it's really fresh in here.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Going back to co-housing for a moment, when the people start to move in, was there a particular way that you recruited them, or is it just as any property you would fill that space? Because I wonder whether just what you're trying to do attracts the right people.
I'm sure looking from the outside, people might say we're all of a similar ilk, but being on the inside, we all look very different to me. I think there's about as much diversity on our street as you'd probably find on any street with houses of a similar mix of value. We didn't have a vetting process. We had what we called an integration process. So we made sure that people got to know us and what they were letting themselves in for, and we got to know them a bit. So there was a possibility, I suppose, to decide not to sell a house to somebody. And we tried to explain to people as best as we could, given everything that was going on, as much of the detail of what they were getting involved in. It's attracted people who are specifically interested in the community side of what we've done, the co-housing. Then there's some who've been specifically attracted to the passive house. And then there are people who might be in the middle, and then there's people who've learned that actually they didn't care about co-housing, but now they're really quite interested in it. And we've attracted people from the local area in Lancaster, but we've also attracted people from the north of Scotland, south coast of England. So quite a few people have moved big distances to join this. Probably most of the movers because of the community element, but some of them have moved also because of the passive house element.
I was sitting with a mother and daughter and having a bite to eat in your little village room. And the daughter had just returned from university, and I was asking, is it a bit strange? Because I think they downsized from a bigger house. And she said, what I really like is I know my mum's safe here.
Yeah, I've heard that comment by a few parents who've kind of said that their kids are sort of relieved that they probably won't have to do quite so much looking after them in their later years as they might feel obliged to do.
I think she's very capable. Don't get me wrong here.
Yeah. I've called this my pension plan, that instead of investing in financial savings, I'm investing in social capital, that I'm getting to know people so that when I am in my old age, not sort of hospital stage, but just need a little bit of help every now and again. 99% of the time I could be living in the house independently, but there's just that one thing that would trip me up that would require me to go into care home. And hopefully, the research in Denmark and the States has shown that people living in co-housing delay that process. So the average time that co-houser spends in a care home is 2 weeks of their life. So yeah, hopefully that will happen. I mean, I did know the first time I was ill, my next door neighbour, 2 doors up, came about 10 o'clock in the morning and just knocked on my door and said, "Oh, are you okay? Is there anything you need?" And I was just like, "Yeah, I am a bit ill actually. But how did you know that? Because I've only just woken up and worked it out for myself that I'm not feeling well." And she just said, "Well, I noticed you won't follow your usual pattern." And I was kind of like, "Well, what is my usual pattern?" And what she noticed about it. So I think that might play out. And I think that's why quite a few people are attracted to this. There's this general sense of support. So the couple of the kids go off to school together and there's only one parent taking them. Not all the time, but sometimes the parents can bring the kids to the communal meal. Well, I suppose it happens relatively often. Sometimes the kids don't like the food. And they haven't had to shop and cook. The kids are just playing around and you don't know who's looking after them, but you do know somebody's looking after them, or next door. He's like 4, he comes in. It might take Jessica an hour or an hour and a half before she just comes to check that I haven't got fed up of him yet. So yeah, there's loads of forms of mutual support.
What's been the biggest challenge of this whole journey that you've been on?
Some people say, that co-housing is awesome and awful. And the best thing about co-housing is the people, and the worst thing about co-housing is the people. So decision making can be a bit of a challenge. And the amount of work has been pretty, it has been an £8 million project to manage in spare time. Some of us had appropriate skills, but it's not something any of us had done before. Some of us were overloaded, burnt out, resentments built up with some people who others felt weren't doing as much. So that's been hard work, but I think it's a bit like having a baby. It might be hard to conceive. There's a big, long pregnancy. There's giving birth. There's terrible twos. There's teenage years, but you wouldn't know what to do without them. So I think co-housing is a bit like that. That this is my family, and like in families, they drive me up the wall, but also they are my life.
And finally, do you think co-housing has a lot of growth still to come around the world?
Certainly, if we're going to follow a Danish pattern. Recently 10% of new build in Denmark was co-housing. 2% of the population in Denmark lives in co-housing. There's, some of the surveys that have been done by the UK co-housing network, which is the national network that promotes co-housing, indicates that about 50% of the population are interested in living in a context that is similar to co-housing. So it has the features of co-housing. If you go out and ask people, do you want to live in co-housing? They're going to say, what's that? And they're going to say no. But if you ask people, would you like to know your neighbours? Or if you break down the forms of mutual support, about maybe having guest bedrooms, about having a children's room, about maybe eating communally sometimes, consistently it seems to be about 50% of people say that they would like to live in that way. So there's certainly the desire for co-housing. I think to make it really happen, we need to see developers get involved, because you need to be superhuman really to manage the process. So if we can, like in Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, and the US, there are commercial developers who do co-housing, and there are housing associations that do it. So we're starting to see that. We're starting to see interest come from commercial developers and housing associations. And at the moment, the current government is giving support to this concept. So we're seeing a lot more interest and a lot more requests coming to us at the UK Co-housing Network, which I happen to be involved in, both from the media, from government, and from community groups and from individuals. So yeah, I think everybody's wowed when they come here, even though some people might think it's not for them. I think when they see what it really looks like, it's just like, oh yeah, I could live like that.
Well, it's been a great overview of co-housing. Mark, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed that. I do get quite excited about co-housing now. I just imagine if the land around where I live was being developed as co-housing, I would be so much happier. And I'm not sure whether this is just a UK term, but we have the acronym NIMBY, not in my backyard. And it's often said that people are anti-development or anti-this and anti-that, and they're NIMBYs. Sometimes I find myself in this category too, but hopefully in a good way, that it's about the big companies that come into your towns, your villages, and just build something that they really could not care less what went there, so long as they realise their profits. And that's why I like this people power route, really, creating something that they just want it to be so good and such a nice community. And I really think after my trip to Lancaster co-housing that they've achieved some great things. And it does mean for this podcast that I have to explore some more co-housing at some point or other. I'd love to hear from you if you're in one of the co-housing developments around the world. He mentioned obviously a lot in Denmark, but the other co-housing developments in the States. And I think it would be great for us to almost check in with someone that's coming up. Oh, we've got this idea. We want to start going down the co-housing route, and just catch up with them every few months to see how they progress, because it's a long old process, as I think you might have heard from that interview. So I would like your feedback too. We always like your comments, and my question is, can you imagine yourself living this way? That's the question that we have in the show notes. So houseplanninghelp.com/28. We have some photos in there, also the video that my production company Regen Media made for the UK Passive House Awards, and as it turned out, they were the winners as well in their category for group and social housing. And I think having all those first, particularly this one aspect of delivering these passive house homes at the market value, so they weren't paying any premium on that. It's just been a very, very successful project. So go and take a look at that. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that I've been doing the House Planning Help podcast for a year. Well, something that I really want to do is to put together an ebook of the key things that I've learnt in that year. It's a chance for me to go back really into the archive, but to have a reason to do this and to bring you something that's much more convenient. Obviously, we have all of that information. It's free for you. It's on the website, but I want to put it into another form. And I do sometimes wonder whether certain points, because I hear these going round time and again thinking, oh, that's been told in a different way. But if we actually just concentrated on some of these concepts a lot, whether what we get out would be hugely better. Whereas think, oh, that's a good concept, dealing with it a little bit and then moving straight on. So that's what I'd love to do. But I feel I can't do that unless it's beneficial to you. So my call to action today is that if you're someone who is looking to self-build and renovate, and perhaps you're just coming into this near the beginning of the process or haven't quite got to that stage of knowing when you're going to be building, I'd love your feedback and your input into this ebook. So if you can come and visit this address, houseplanninghelp.com/input, and I have a quick questionnaire. I'd love to ask you some things on there. Please, if you have the time, this would mean a lot to me. houseplanninghelp.com/input. What I'm also thinking is that I'd really like to make this a regular occurrence. If it sells well and if it's useful to you, every year that I complete, I would like to create an ebook that reflects back on that past year. So that's the idea of it. If you can help me out there with your feedback, that would be great. Next time, we're looking at being clever with space. My guest is Sarah Suzanka, architect and best-selling author of The Not So Big House and many other books as well. Join me then.